A shining star in the Sega universe. This is Sega Masters. We've reached November of 1988, and yes, it's the one you've been waiting for. Today, we're looking at Phantasy Star, often considered the crown jewel of the Master System library, and one of the few reasons many longtime gamers even remember Sega had a console in North America prior to the Genesis. This episode also gives us a much needed break from all the arcade conversions we've been flooded with as of late, as Phantasy Star is noteworthy for being the second console fantasy role-playing game to be released in North America, and came at a time when the Master System needed something special to take on the Nintendo juggernaut. What's often neglected about the competition between the Master System and the Nintendo Entertainment System during the 1980s was how Sega wasn't helping their console's cause by sticking with their mentality as a coin-op company, relying mostly on coin-op conversions of varying quality or simple arcade-style games to try and sell the Master System to American consumers. Games that more often than not showed all it had to offer in one 20-minute playthrough. Even Sega's best arcade ports still paled in comparison to what Nintendo and its third-party allies were publishing on the NES, including the long-awaited sequel to The Legend of Zelda, which was released in time for Christmas of 1988. The flawed, yet still worthy Adventure of Link continued its predecessor's tradition of featuring a large world to explore, plenty of secrets to find, RPG-style character growth, and would take many hours to canvas inside and out. If the Master System was to have any chance to compete against Nintendo during that critical holiday season, arcade ports obviously weren't the answer, especially bad coin-op conversions like last episode's Thunderblade, and Tonka's marketing efforts weren't going to change that. Sega needed something special to show the gaming public they were capable of producing their own large-scale adventure-style titles that were on par with Zelda 2 and the like. Sega faced the almost exact challenge the previous fall in Japan, where Nintendo's console was reaping the benefits from the rapidly growing market of console fantasy role-playing games, led by the runaway success of NX's Dragon Quest franchise. The second game in the series was burning up the sales charts for most of 1987, and pretty much established the template many other RPGs followed to the letter. It also inspired one struggling company to craft a role-playing title as a last resort to keep their sinking ship afloat. Square's company-saving Hail Mary, Final Fantasy, made its debut in December of 1987 and was a top seller as well, while putting a few of its own touches on the standard console RPG formula. With most of the RPGs out there exclusive to the Famicom, Sega decided their console needed a fantasy role-playing game of its own to grab a piece of this ever-expanding pie. Back in episode 60, we covered Sega's first attempt at an RPG for the Master System, Miracle Warriors, which was an adaptation of an old Japanese computer game by Kagato Software known as Haja no Fuin. While it wasn't a terrible first try, it stuck a little too closely to its PC roots and was an overly difficult slog, not very tailored for the cartridge crowd. Sega quickly realized a mulligan was in order and turned to a team of their top talent at the time, led by character designer Riko Kodama and lead programmer Yuji Naka, both of whom would go on to superstar careers. The team's goal was to create a quest that would fit better on a gaming platform without being just another Dragon Warrior clone, but they also wanted something that was unlike any console RPG up to that point. That vision came to pass on the 20th of December 1987, when Phantasy Star was unleashed on the gaming public, and its standout features helped it become a huge hit for Sega. The game would go on to birth another beloved Sega franchise, spawning 3 main sequels on the Genesis and a few side entries across the different consoles. With the game a bona fide success in Japan, Sega now sought to bring it to the US a year later, where it would join with Miracle Warriors as an introduction of light RPGs to American console gamers, since the NES wouldn't get its first role-playing games in the West until the following summer. The ads that ran in the gaming magazines featured some enticing screenshots promising something American gamers had never seen before. However, putting the game on a 4 mega cartridge with a lithium battery caused it to retail for $70, so Phantasy Star would have to be something truly special to justify such an asking price. Phantasy Star does show how special it is from the moment you select Start on the title screen, as you're treated to this cool intro that sets the table for your quest. This game takes us to the Algol star system that's under the tyrannical rule of the once benevolent King Lassic, who became evil after being corrupted by a strange religion. One young man, Nero Lansdale, joined a rebellion to end Lassic's oppression and discover his secrets, only to be hunted down by the king's troops. Following the attack, Nero's sister Elish rushes to his side, only for him to die in her arms while breathing his last words begging her to take over his cause. So Elish decides to finish what her brother started and bring down Lassic herself. Yes, Phantasy Star is one of the few games of the 8-bit era to have a female protagonist in the spotlight. True, there were certain other cartridges also starring female heroes at the time, but that bit of info was usually kept under wraps, and you had to first beat the game before the supposedly shocking reveal during the ending. Once the game begins in earnest, you immediately get treated to Phantasy Star's unique setting that injects some futuristic science fiction into the swords and sorcery medieval fantasy you expect in a Dragon Warrior style adventure, which would become one of the series' trademarks. Elish begins her journey in her hometown of Kamenet, and her first main task is to find some allies to join her cause, including the warrior Nero spoke about with his dying breath, Odin. Naturally, the town is teeming with non-playable characters to speak with and information to obtain for her upcoming quest, whether about Odin or the surrounding landscape. This card does not waste any opportunity to flex its 4 megs of muscle as the game switches to a first-person view when interacting with other folk or entering buildings, depicting people and places through full-screen portraits, in essence letting you see these conversations through Alyssa's eyes. Like other 8-bit quests, you start out rather weak, with only a short sword and few funds to your name, so as you'd expect you have to venture out into the world and invest some time fighting randomly encountered monsters to build up your stats and bank account to purchase new equipment. When you do bump into a hostile creature, you switch over to the battle scene, which follows the turn-based Dragon Warrior mold, with you viewing your aggressors through your eyes as you choose from the standard commands of using items, spells, or a physical attack. After both sides exchange blows, you set things up for the next turn, and so it goes until one side wins, as usual. Every battle you're victorious in earns you experience points and Meseta, the game's currency, though you have to open the treasure chest left behind by the slain monsters to actually obtain your payout. Then you wander around until the next creepy comes up looking to take you out. Thing is, you may only see one creature on the screen, but you often take on groups of up to 6 baddies, though they're the same type of monster. Also, the treasure chests are sometimes booby-trapped and will damage you. Phantasy Star does require a good amount of grinding in the early going to build up your strength as well as acquire the funds for good equipment, but once you gain a few levels, things do flow much smoother. And you have your friend in Kamenet who will heal you for free and can be visited any number of times, which definitely helps as you try to slog your way through the early stages of your level building. Just be careful not to wander too far from the protective wall too soon, or you may find yourself against a tougher monster you may not quite be prepared for. Once you feel you're ready enough, you can branch out further away from Kamenet to take on the tougher beasts and visit the other towns, such as the port city of Skyon. Here you have more townsfolk to converse with and you're tasked to get more clues about Odin's whereabouts and any other potential allies you might be able to recruit. Oddly enough, the sprites just stand in place like statues waiting for you to walk up to them, instead of milling about their business like other RPGs. Of course, you have the shops to spend all the hard-earned Meseta that's burning a hole in your pocket. The armories specialize in either weapons, armor, or shields, and you are presented with the choice of either buying a cheap yet affordable item now, or saving up for the more expensive and therefore better gear down the line. For your new armament to actually do anything, you do have to go into the menu screen and manually equip it. You then have the second-hand stores, your basic item shops that offer simple yet important tools, and will even buy your old stuff you don't want anymore. A few of these stores also just happen to offer a critical quest item, though actually purchasing them can take quite a bit of work, either due to a high price or needing some persistence to convince the shopkeeper to sell you those secrets he mentioned. In an odd twist, this world also features something called first food shops. Possibly a bit of mistranslation since they sell burgers and colas that function as quick healing items. Yet you might notice vials on the table, making you wonder if these was originally pharmacies, and Sega tried to get a little clever for the Western localization. Other important buildings include churches that inform you of your leveling up progress and can resurrect fallen allies, and instead of inns, you visit hospitals to recover your hit points. Now, a role-playing game wouldn't be a role-playing game without dungeons and caverns that need to be explored in order to find a special key item or major enemy to slay, and you find the first of these to the south of Caminite. Most of these caves start out pitch black and thus require a flash to light up your path. That said, in lieu of using the same top-down perspective as other console quests, this card takes a cue from American computer RPGs such as Wizardry or The Bard's Tale by presenting these caverns with a first-person 3D perspective. Unlike those titles, these dungeons have a very convincing look to them with bricked walls and ceilings that fade into the background, and you're treated as some smooth scrolling and rotation as you navigate through the twisting corridors instead of static screens and instant turns for every step you take. Just be aware there's no auto-map feature to keep track of your progress through the cave. You need to draw or find your own maps. Now at the end of this first cave is what appears to be a soldier that's been turned to stone, and naturally you need to find a way to possibly restore him to normal since he might come in handy. It isn't long before you learn just how ambitious Phantasy Star aims to be. Once you gain access to the spaceport, there you can purchase a passport which will allow you to board a transport shuttle that will fly you through space to another planet. While most RPGs offer one large world with a few continents to explore, Phantasy Star trumps that by having your quest span 3 distinct planets, each one with its own unique ecosystems and indigenous life. This shuttle takes you to the desert planet of Motavia, and you will be jumping back and forth between the two planets quite a few times in the early stages. Later in the game, you'll be able to visit the ice planet of Dezoris. It's here on Motavia where Alice meets the first of her 3 companions. One shop in Paseo will let you trade the seemingly useless Laconian pot you received at the beginning of your quest in order to receive an intelligent cat-like creature named Meow. And you're treated to another beautifully illustrated cutscene showing Alice and Meow forming a bond. Granted, story sequences for important events are commonplace, if not expected nowadays, but back in 1988 this was practically unheard of for console games. To think the Master System faithful got to enjoy these cinematics long before Ninja Gaiden and other carts were doing the same for American NES gamers. Now, despite his appearance, Meow is a very capable partner for Alice, able to fight enemies with claws and learn a few helpful spells. He also just happens to have the means to recruit your second ally. Going back to the first dungeon, the bottle of Anselin that Meow has around his neck can restore the petrified soldier you found earlier, and he indeed turns out to be Odin, who's basically the muscle of the group and the only one that can use laser guns. These brief cutscenes offer the only real glimpses into each hero's personality, yet still manage to present the protagonists as actual characters, far more than what the other RPGs of the time were doing for their heroes. It especially outclassed Final Fantasy, which basically only featured a quartet of generic protagonists defined solely by their job class. Even with your 2 new friends in tow, you still have quite a bit of grinding ahead of you to get their levels up and afford new and pricey equipment for everybody. At least the cart treats you to some outstanding visuals and solid audio, especially during the fighting sequences. Riko Kodama's enemy creatures are well drawn with cool designs and details, but instead of simply being still pics, you watch as they strike back at you with some fluid animations for their attacks. The well done backdrops also reflect where the skirmish is taking place, even changing depending on the terrain. A few also have some nice animated touches like the moving waves at the beach. On the other hand, you don't actually see your characters in action, as their counter-strikes are handled with typical slash animations on the screen, though they are unique based on the weapon or spell used. Nonetheless, this puts the battle sequences of Dragon Warrior 2 to shame, with their still pictures and plain black backgrounds while enemy attacks were displayed entirely through text and sound effects, along with an occasional flash to indicate a cast spell. The travel scenes aren't too shabby either, with detailed terrain and colorful, not quite super deformed sprites showing the heroes on the move in single file. The soundtrack, composed by Tokuhiko Uwabu, is also mostly well done with good background tunes used throughout the game, from the overworld tunes to the spooky dungeon theme. Some may prefer the soundtrack from the initial Japanese version that uses the FM chip found in the original Mark III console, but for the most part it's no real loss. The audio does lose a few points due to some rather grating sound effects during the fight scenes. While there isn't a whole lot of story scenes, a few major happenings do keep the plot moving. Fulfilling certain objectives will allow you an audience with the governor of Motavia, and he'll mention one more companion you can possibly enlist, even giving you a letter that will convince him to join your cause. However, after he offers to let your party rest for the night, the trio are treated to a nightmare which features this strange creature, the mislabeled succubus, that easily slaughters them, possibly one of the first intentionally unwinnable battles in RPGdom. Once all three heroes are killed, they wake up and everything's fine. Or maybe this was merely your first glimpse of the dark force you're truly up against. Eventually, after making your way through another dungeon, you'll meet up with your last companion, Noah, who's a jerk to you at first until you show him the governor's letter, which will convince him to cast his lots with your team. And yes, despite what the governor said earlier in the video, Noah is clearly a male, another infamous mistranslation. In any case, Noah mentions your next objective and joins your team to fill the mage role, weak on physical attacks but able to learn some powerful spells. There is no way to customize the characters as all four are pretty much set in their individual strengths and talents, including specific armor and weapons that only each one can use. Still, their unique abilities complement the others nicely, helping to make this group feel like a well-rounded unit. At the same time, you'll wish there was more interaction among your crew or with anybody else. In fact, after the meeting with Noah, you basically never hear from the heroes again, as they're pretty much silent for just about the rest of the game. As a consequence, you learn hardly anything further about them, which will disappoint those used to Final Fantasy style character development. Naturally, being a 1980s role-playing game means some parts haven't quite aged very well, including the somewhat erratic monster encounter rate. One moment you can pass through a region relatively untouched, the next you're spammed with battles at every step, which can get particularly frustrating when you're just trying to get your weary party to the nearest town to heal up. At least the interface itself is rather simple to use. In fact, it may be a little too simplistic for adventurers used to the vast strategic options of later RPGs. Most battles are simply a matter of repeatedly choosing attack until one side triumphs, with an occasional spell thrown in from a small selection. Another slight annoyance is how you don't get to pick your target when pitted against a group of foes. Your character just chooses one of the baddies at random to strike, which also limits what little strategy you can employ. Then again, the streamlined battle system means you can just mow down baddies in short order without having to think too much about what to do. And you're not inflicted with any status ailments during the fights, like being poisoned or put to sleep or so forth. You can become temporarily bound and unable to move, but that's it. In another unique twist, there are instances when you may not even need to fight. You often bump into intelligent folk you can actually speak with via the talk command, and usually these beings will just exchange a few words then send you on your way, thus letting you avoid an unnecessary battle. Communication with a few other creatures is also possible with the use of certain items and spells. Later in the game, you can obtain your own spaceship, piloted by Harpsy the robot here, that lets you travel freely between the three worlds, including making your first visit to Dozoris. With your party complete and now able to visit all three planets at will, The next large chunk of your quest is mainly concerned with preparing to confront Lassic by finding each hero's strongest equipment, as well as other essential artifacts required to locate and breach the king's floating castle. Sadly, this is where Phantasy Star loses quite a bit of steam after such a strong start, as the game suddenly stops giving you any clear direction to take in your journey. You're mostly left to your own devices for your galaxy-spanning scavenger hunt, but often unsure where to actually find these items or what you're even supposed to be doing. Thus, you're spending quite some time wandering the landscape hoping to stumble onto something, whether it's one of the caverns containing the item or a town that might offer any sort of clue on where to go next. This card does mostly give you the freedom to explore at your leisure, and the remaining territory of each planet gradually becomes open to you as you progress through your journey, especially once you obtain certain vehicles such as this Land Rover that allows access to previously unreachable areas. Nonetheless, you're still finding yourself chatting with an endless stream of villagers, hoping for some sort of clue as to your next objective. Some of these conversations can be rather amusing. Can't argue that point there. This brings up another somewhat annoying issue. Certain essential items won't actually appear unless you talk to the right person to activate the flags, even if you reach said item's location and search for it ahead of schedule. For example, your search for the robot will bring you to the ruined town of Bortevo. If you check out the first house you come to, you find this pile of junk, and examining it reveals nothing special, giving you the idea there isn't anything of importance to be found there. Later on, when you visit the town of Casbah in Motavia, you meet this guy who mentions a hovercraft he once owned, but abandoned back on Bortevo, even though you didn't find it after possibly investigating all the houses for Harpsy. Making a second trip to Bortevo, visiting the same house as earlier, and searching the very same pile of junk that previously didn't have anything special to it, and lo and behold, you find the hovercraft when it wasn't there before, even though it was supposed to have been buried under that junk for quite some time. It's a rather head-shaking flaw, but at least you seldom run into it. The game also gets rather heavy on dungeon crawling during the stretch, as you need to traverse a slew of convoluted labyrinths to recover the legendary weapon or armor contained within, which are usually guarded by a massive boss monster. You're not under any constraint to visit these dungeons in a certain order, since only the Tower of Bray Malay is inaccessible without a special item or Noah's open spell. Though it doesn't matter whether it's a cave, a tower, a prison, or even a morgue you're exploring. All the dungeons feature the same brick-walled look for your surroundings other than the different colors. They also usually require you to go up and down different floors multiple times while being wary of a few hidden trapdoors and constant dead ends. The lack of any sort of auto-map feature means you'll need to find or make good maps to avoid getting hopelessly lost. Certain spells in the flute will instantly zap you back to the cave entrance if you need to start over. And forget about searching every nook and cranny for special bonuses or secrets. The chests you stumble across contain mostly paltry sums of money or useless items, not worth going out of your way for. On top of that, the insane amount of random battles with tough creatures you're often forced to endure can weigh you down long before you reach the boss. And unless you packed enough healing items, you may find yourself too beat up to stand a chance against the Guardian. You'll most likely be spending much of your time attempting to run from every battle you can to conserve your strength. Fortunately, Sega took a cue from Nintendo's two Zelda titles by including a lithium battery in their cartridge that could record up to 5 games in progress, and you can save anywhere, even in dungeons. You'll be glad the cart's generous save system allows you to create what is in essence a quick restart point in case something goes wrong, possibly saving you from hours of lost progress. The main sticking point about this chunk of the quest is how the overall storyline is barely heard from, other than brief mentions of Lassic to remind you why you're going through all this. You hardly get any further information about Lassic, or the potential boss creature you had the nightmare about earlier, or even the protagonists themselves. The only time anyone's background is slightly touched on, other than the ending, is when Noah has to engage in a duel with his previously unmentioned mentor late in the game to get his best armor. Too bad none of the other heroes get this treatment or any major events themselves, save Meow for a brief moment toward the finish. Even that's quickly forgotten. Odin doesn't even express any satisfaction when the team finally settles the score with Medusa, who turned him to stone earlier. I know it sounds like I'm being rather harsh on Phantasy Star, given that was Sega's first real attempt at their own original role-playing game. The fact is, this card is very much a product of its time, and certain aspects about it may come off as rather archaic and a little frustrating. The home stretch in particular has you tackling 2 dungeons back to back with no way to heal up and regain magic points in between them, which can make the final showdown with Lassic much tougher than it should be. Should you manage to defeat Lassic, the game throws in one more surprise when you report your triumph to the Motavian governor, as it turns out Lassic isn't your final foe. Yes, it's the old true mastermind behind the boss trope, as you have one more major enemy to slay before you can ultimately claim victory. Yet through it all, Phantasy Star still manages to overcome its warts as a well-done RPG that was ahead of its time, thanks to its many positives and innovations, including its presentation. You get a solid quest that will take a good 15 to 20 hours to complete with a bit of freestyling thrown in. And for what it is, the story is still mostly decently presented and does pick back up when you are able to embark on the path to the final showdowns, even though you'll wish certain parts of the narrative were fleshed out more. Overall, Phantasy Star may have lost some luster over the years, and may not have tilted the 8-bit console wars in the Master System's favor, but it remains a much beloved classic in gaming circles even today, as Sega finally showed it could create their own console-style games on par with the NES hits. And it is still well worth checking out for fans of old-school RPGs and not too hard to find, as it was one of only 2 Master System titles included on the Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and an enhanced version was released in 2018 for the Nintendo Switch under the Sega Ages line. Perhaps if Sega had relied more on deep games like Phantasy Star, instead of mediocre to bad arcade ports to sell their console, the Master System might have fared better in the US than it ultimately did.